Good evening. Today, we continue our discussion of the hypothesis put forward by academician Anatoly Fomenko, according to which, all our ideas about chronology and history are, to put it mildly, distorted. Our guest in the studio tonight is a follower of the academician, a member of the new Chronology research group, Andrei Podoynitsyn. You can also join the conversation with Andrei Maksimov and our late-night guests. Just call the numbers of our live broadcast, and I will take your calls.
Good evening. I must honestly say that I don't know whether our broadcasts are turning out well or not. It's not for me to judge. But of course, it is quite unique that for 3 weeks now we've been talking about such a serious and important historical subject. We are grateful to everyone who has called in. There have been many calls, many emails. We will answer some of your questions. But tonight, we also want to ask you some questions ourselves, or rather, not we, but our guest Andrei Podoynitsyn. The first question has already been posed. We raised it during the show Vremechko. Please, announce our first question.
Good evening, Andrei. We wanted to put these questions to you in order to understand how ready we all are to accept ideas that can literally stun. Just as we ourselves were once shaken and surprised when we came to such results. The first question. Dear viewers, do you believe that Jesus Christ was born in the 11th century?
Let me remind you of the phone numbers. If you believe this, call 880-9575-7531. If you do not believe this, call 880-9575-7532. So far, out of 4 callers, 3 do not believe it, and 1 does. Andrei, last time we spoke about why the hypothesis arose in the first place, that Christ was born in the 11th century. I'd like to ask you now to briefly remind us of that.
In short, the point was that the date of the birth of Jesus Christ did not reach us precisely in the biblical tradition, in the Holy Scripture, but was instead later calculated by the monk Dionysius Exiguus. Anatoly Fomenko and his followers recalculated this date according to certain astronomical parameters and concluded that if the texts of the Gospels and church tradition are taken literally, Jesus Christ was born in the year 1095.
So, it was simply calculated incorrectly back then, and Fomenko later calculated it correctly?
Exactly right.
Now, regarding the questions we are being asked by viewers, if we generalize them, there is one common question, and I think it is very important to address it. We are living now in an era of collapse. A lot is falling apart, starting with our Soviet Empire. Many familiar ideas are collapsing. People long for creativity, for some kind of constructive idea. What troubles many about Fomenko's theory is precisely that it also seems destructive, because it appears to tear down the familiar, established view of history. What would you say to that?
Andrei, if I may, I'd like to give a somewhat more detailed answer to this question, since it's an extremely important topic. If we set aside the labels unfairly attached to academician Fomenko and the entire new chronology group, it makes sense to focus on how we see it, what consequences our theory has, and what conclusions follow from it. First of all, I would like to say what it means for the Russian people, for Russia. Our theory directly undermines and collapses the myth of some kind of primordial cultural backwardness and laziness.
I'm sorry, I can't help but show you this. Do you believe that Jesus Christ was born in the 11th century? Yes. 37, no 36.
Andrei, frankly, I'm astonished.
So am I sorry for interrupting you, but I just couldn't help but show it. Please continue.
Thank you for interrupting me, it's increasing.
Let's see what happens next.
Returning to the answer. First, the myth of Russia's original backwardness and lack of culture collapses. No Varangians were ever invited to Russia to restore order. On the contrary, 600 years ago Russia Horde itself was the metropolis and the builder of the greatest Eurasian empire. Second, no one ever conquered or subjugated Russia. Russia never submitted to anyone and never will, since the combination of Russian resources, above all, a hard-working and numerous population, our great culture and science, vast territory, and colossal natural reserves. All of this together is beyond the strength of any earthly power to overcome. The one great disaster we must truly avoid at all costs is internal strife and civil conflict. In other words, unity and cohesion are the greatest commandment handed down by our ancestors.
Am I correct in understanding that if history unfolded within more compact timeframes, this also suggests that the human being has much greater potential than previously thought?
First of all, human beings inherently carry rationality. Humanity has never wandered for 5,000 years in any enchanted circles, and there were never any mysterious rises and mysterious falls. There is no gene of self-destruction in humanity. Humanity has always developed progressively, along an upward curve, from, so to speak, lower and less developed forms of civilization to higher ones. And it has developed with astonishing speed. We can say that our civilization is still in its infancy. It is only just now reaching a qualitatively new level. At present, there can be no predetermined inevitability of a third world war or anything like that. Let's look at the reconstruction of the histories of various religions. If we take into account that all religions, all major world denominations, are blood brothers, all stemming from a common source, then ideas such as the supposed inevitability of a global clash between Christianity and Islam look like sheer nonsense and even blasphemy. On the contrary, we share so much in common that the idea of peaceful coexistence and a social contract appears far more sensible and rational.
We already have calls. Let's listen. Please, Max.
The calls came in during the very first seconds of our broadcast. That's why their subject matter is a bit retrospective, touching on what you said at the beginning of the talk show. Calls tend to have a certain inertia. Maria Arkadyevna, please go ahead.
Good evening. I'm very glad I've managed to get through for the third time. I'll try to ask my question briefly. It has to do with the date of Christ's birth. If, of course, we can include this unscientific fact in the system of evidence. You claim it was the 11th century because there was a total solar eclipse at the time of the crucifixion. But none of the four Gospels gives a full description of the event. Luke only says the sun grew dark. In one of the Gospels there's no mention of it at all. In another, it simply says there was great darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour. Those are the only primary sources. Could you please explain how you interpret events like eclipses in chronicles? How can such vague details be included in a system of arguments?
Thank you very much, Maria Arkadyevna. The thing is, astronomical events are actually described in chronicles quite clearly and understandably. For example, when it comes to solar eclipses, like the one said to have accompanied Christ's execution, the texts often mention the appearance of stars. Now, stars becoming visible during the day indicates a particular phase of an eclipse, which can be expressed in angular minutes, seconds, and so on. But if we cast doubt in principle on the possibility of interpreting solar and lunar eclipses accurately in chronicles, then I have to ask, how did medieval scholars like Scaliger and Petavius make their calculations of dates? You see, we'd end up in a kind of vicious circle, where supposedly there are no astronomical methods of precise dating at all. In fact, such criteria do exist, and they're well worked out in scientific literature. Among astronomers there's even, I think, a sort of consensus on how to interpret a given description. As for the date of Christ's birth, the point is that quite often there was debate over whether it was a solar or a lunar eclipse. This reinterpretation came about because no solar eclipse could be found in the required time frame, so they tried to substitute a lunar one instead. Lunar eclipses are, of course, easier to locate.
There was also a call from a 10th grader in Moscow. I even remember his name, Sergei Alexeyev. He went on a school trip to Novgorod and visited the local history museum. I spoke to him myself. He had a very simple, almost naive, but actually interesting question. He said, there were birch bark manuscripts on display. The sign said, birch bark manuscript, and next to it was a date. So, are we basically not supposed to believe anything that it was found, or the date that's written on it? What should I tell him?
That question isn't naive at all. It's more than reasonable. Each of us, when first studying Fomenko's ideas, asked ourselves the same thing. Naturally, there is a certain material foundation that must and should be trusted. But the problem is, there are still many questions about datings. For example, when a chronicle or a fundamental work is claimed to be precisely dated to such and such year. If possible, Andrei, I'd like to give a broader answer here, to say what we really think on this subject. In this context, let's recall, how did the chronological scale we use today even arise? We touched on this before, but only in passing. What actually happened? What did Scaliger and Petavius really do for the first time? First, they introduced the absolute timeline we now know as before Christ and after Christ. They chose the birth of Christ as the key reference point. That had never been done before. After that, certain key anchor points were calculated on this absolute timeline. This wasn't only their doing. Their predecessors had made similar attempts, but they applied it systematically, on a large scale. Above all, the date of Christ's birth, the Peloponnesian War, the dating of Ptolemy Almagest, the timelines in Livy, and so on. Once those anchor points were calculated, they began to slot in rulers, kingdoms, cultures, civilizations, and so forth. Everything that academician Fomenko has done can be called practically the first attempt in 400 years, since no such comprehensive calculations had been carried out before. He simply, in good faith, recalculated all possible dates, just recalculated, that's all. In rough terms, he did exactly the same thing that Scaliger and Petavius once did. Because we are facing a striking paradox. Somehow, we have canonized the mathematical calculations that scholars made 400 years ago. Yet those calculations only reflected the level of science of the early 17th century, along with all the misconceptions and errors of that time. What prevents us today, with the enormous body of knowledge accumulated by science over the past 400 years, from recalculating everything and simply retracing their steps? I was astonished when I discovered that, as it turns out, there is not a single modern work on chronology in existence. Nobody is doing these calculations anymore. If such a work does exist, not only I, but all of us would be extremely grateful if someone pointed it out. But we have never come across one. So, it seems that chronology, as a science, ceased to exist at the beginning of the 17th century. It fulfilled its purpose, and since then it has basically fossilized.
Max, please, let's take a call.
The range of viewers calling in is truly unique. For example, Marina Arkadievna, who had a PhD in computer graphics, yes, even that exists. We had a call from a physicist specializing in planetary physics, who already got his answer. And now, please introduce yourself.
Psychologist Vladimir Semyonovich.
Please, your question.
My question is this. The Jewish calendar counts 5,760 years. We believe Islam has existed for 1,300 years. But if we subtract 1,000 years, then Islam has only existed for 300 years. That would mean that as a religion, Islam is only 300 years old. How do you explain that?
Vladimir Semyonovich, good evening. And secondly, forgive me, Andrei, you'll laugh, but actually Vladimir Semyonovich has hit the mark. Once again, please understand that I'm not hallucinating. According to the reconstruction undertaken by the academician in our group, the picture of the history of religions looks approximately like this. Initially there was only one religion, monotheism. In fact, Christianity is monotheism, and Islam is monotheism. That is the essence of both. The splitting of religions into separate denominations happened much later. To say 300 years ago is probably too strong, but the process apparently began in the 15th century, and by the 16th century it was becoming very pronounced, since political conditions had developed that required religious division, as the empire itself was politically breaking apart.
Now we'll turn to another very important topic concerning the ancient world. We're going to pause our interactive poll. First question, let's see the results. Do you believe that Jesus Christ was born in the 11th century? Yes. 120 people. No. 81 people. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, calls are paid. I'll ask Andrei first to pose the second question, and then to analyze these results. Please, your second question.
You know, Andrei, after such, in my opinion, an absolutely fantastic result, let's move forward exponentially. Let's increase the sharpness of the question, so to speak. Dear viewers, do you believe that ancient Rome and ancient Greece never existed in the traditional sense of those words?
Let me repeat the phone numbers. If you believe this, and now Andrei Vladimirovich will provide some arguments, call 880-9575-7531. If you don't believe this, call 880-9575-7532. Now, please, briefly if possible, we already have calls. Do you believe that ancient Rome and ancient Greece never existed? Am I right in understanding that you do believe this?
Yes.
Please explain.
The word faith doesn't quite fit here. Personally, I am convinced. In previous broadcasts we talked about how, as a result of the astronomical and statistical reconstruction of history, we obtained results indicating that what we know as the history of the ancient world and the so-called Dark Ages is, in all likelihood, nothing more than a phantom reflection. A kind of duplicate of the real history of the Middle Ages. Because of the unreadability of chronicles, political bias, difficulties with dating, and so on, different descriptions of the very same events emerged, and some of those descriptions were interpreted as independent accounts and pushed back into antiquity, since there was nowhere else to put them. That, in a nutshell, is the situation.
I already said this in the last broadcast, but let me repeat it now. One of my favorite books is Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece. So, are you saying there was no ancient Greece? Then where did its legends and myths come from?
The legends and myths were, are, and always will be, and our distant descendants will admire them as well. There's no doubt about that. But let's turn to facts and numbers. Let's take the famous work of the greatest of the ancient Greek historians, Thucydides. It's simply titled History. In this work he describes the Peloponnesian War, which lasted 27 years. Thucydides himself was a direct participant and eyewitness. This work is essentially canonized. It is not questioned and lies at the foundation of modern history. And yet, in history, Thucydides describes 2 solar and 1 lunar eclipses with intervals of 7 and 11 years.
Let's announce the poll results. Do you believe that ancient Rome and ancient Greece never existed? Yes, I believe it, 53 people. No, I don't believe it, 21 people.
I don't understand what's going on, Andrei. Honestly, speaking from the heart. Let's go back to Thucydides. So, Petavius calculated when those eclipses could have occurred. In this way he dated both Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, and that section of Greek history. His result was the 5th century BC. Academician Fomenko, Gleb Nosovsky, and other researchers simply recalculated those eclipses. Before them, Morozov had done the same. Their result: one fell in the 11th century AD, another in the 12th. And what does that mean? I won't claim anything outright right now, but I want to ask our skeptics. What does it mean? If Thucydides was wrong, then it's fair to ask, on what basis did Petavius send the Peloponnesian War to the 5th century BC? On the other hand, if Thucydides was right, and the dating should be to the 11th–12th century AD, and the Peloponnesian War belongs there, then what are we supposed to do with entire massive layers of Greek history that were placed on the historical timeline in relation to those wars?
Let's take a call, because I'm hearing an awful lot of new terms here. Let's listen.
Marina Pavlovna, with a question not directly about history itself, but still quite reasonable and very interesting. Please, Marina Pavlovna.
Hello, I would like to know, did academician Fomenko cooperate with the Patriarchate and Church authorities? Because for Orthodox believers academician Fomenko has no authority at all. I belong to that group myself. For me, my authority is my church leadership and the Patriarchate. What do they say on this matter? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Here I have to speak for myself personally. I have never heard from Anatoly Fomenko himself, or from Gleb Nosovsky, or from anyone else, that there was any kind of direct cooperation with the Patriarchate or other official church figures. And personally, I am not aware of the official position of the Russian Orthodox Church. The only thing I do know is that I personally had conversations with Orthodox clergymen, with Muslim clergymen, and they were very constructive. We talked business. I don't want to say that they agreed with everything. No. I must say that in both confessions there is very strict discipline, but the tone itself was exceptionally kind and friendly. People genuinely wanted to understand, and generally speaking, many of the conclusions seemed quite reasonable to them.
I wanted to say something I repeat in every broadcast. To me it seems very important. The emergence of Fomenko's hypothesis is evidence of incredible intellectual work. That's the most important thing, and in my opinion, it cannot fail to command respect from both believers and non-believers. An established scholar, a mathematician with a scientific reputation is working on this. That fact alone deserves respect. Agreeing or disagreeing is a separate matter. As for the ancient world, so, there was no ancient Egypt either?
Of course.
Then the question of the pyramids comes up.
That's a great question, Andrei. And in fact, it arose a very long time ago. The brightest example is the famous Egyptian pyramids, which are dated to the 3rd millennium BC. And many researchers have long had a very basic, logical question. Just logically, what do we get? It turns out that the largest human-made structures on Earth, which remain so to this day, were supposedly built at the very dawn of human civilization. At a time when scientific, cultural, industrial, and any other potential was still minimal, just beginning to develop. And precisely at that moment, the largest monuments on Earth were supposedly built.
Suspicious.
Honestly, yes. Then you need to pay attention to another fact. Of course, people try to explain how the pyramids were built. But I must honestly tell you, Andrei, if a modern builder were given the task of constructing a pyramid exclusively with manual labor, and he started suggesting the kinds of methods usually proposed as explanations, for example, building a 1.5 kilometer long ramp up to the top of the pyramid and dragging blocks along it, or building some kind of spiral ramp around the pyramid.
I remember those pictures.
Yes, those are the ones I'm thinking of. He would be immediately sent to a mental institution with a grim diagnosis. Because it is so irrational and uneconomical that there are simply no words to describe.
But they do exist.
Of course they exist. And of course they are human-made. The key is to properly understand who built them, when, and also, why. And why there are no original inscriptions on them, or supposedly none. That needs to be understood, but not ignored as if there were no problem at all. You see, Andrei, what can really be called unconstructive is the a priori denial of the problem itself. We are deeply convinced that the pyramids were built in an entirely different era.
And when?
In the Middle Ages.
How?
Andrei, I'm afraid my answer will leave in shock even those viewers who believe that Christ was born in the 11th century. This is just a version. I must honestly say I don't fully share it yet, but there is such a version. And already today it is being illustrated by certain material evidence. Concrete.
This pause is for letting it sink in. The Middle Ages. That means the 14th, 15th centuries. So, what was being built at that time? And what do historians believe was indeed built then?
Roughly speaking, one can say that the pyramids were erected around the same time as, for example, the Colosseum. In terms of monumentality and the knowledge required for such a massive structure, they are generally speaking comparable.
Explain to me, as someone who doesn't really know much about this, can't you take a sample of the materials the pyramids are made of? Modern science can't determine what it is.
Unfortunately, Andrei, that is pretty much the situation. The pyramid is limestone, meaning, organic remains are indeed present in the pyramids, but determining when they got inside is very difficult. And as far as we know, there's still no way to definitively date the stone itself.
Not date it, but determine what it is.
Sorry, I must have misunderstood. Where did the idea of concrete even come from? From the fact that the blocks making up the pyramids were brought in, and on the faces of these blocks distinct impressions of mats were visible. In other words, of molds. A mold is a frame into which a mixture is poured and then watered. Strictly speaking, this is not an idea of academician Fomenko.
Let me interrupt you here, because we need to check the results of our interactive poll. We also have a third question. Do you believe? Read it yourself, since I think you'll find it interesting. In other words, how many people believe?
It turns out that twice as many believe it as don't.
That is, 93 people believe that ancient Rome and ancient Greece never existed, and 46 people don't believe that. Please ask the third question, and then we definitely need to comment on it.
The third question follows logically from the first two. Dear viewers, do you believe that our civilization is only 1,000 years old?
Let me repeat the phone numbers. Just a reminder, the call is paid. It costs 5 rubles. Dial 880-9575-7531 if you believe this statement. If you don't believe it, dial 880-9575-7532. You know, the results of the previous poll honestly surprised me, because as I see it, people seem willing to take in this kind of new information. Do I understand that correctly? How would you assess it?
It seems to me that these frankly, fantastic poll results demonstrate an extraordinary flexibility of perception and quite simply, the ability to process numbers and facts.
I think this isn't the first time we've seen such a situation, where ordinary people, just those who are curious but not specialists, turn out to be more flexible than the specialists. They are ready to take in new ideas.
Andrei, my experience talking with people unfamiliar with Fomenko's theory suggests that technical professionals, like military officers, for whom concepts such as logistical support, daily vehicle mileage, and so on, are second nature, or engineers, understand it perfectly if you speak their language. Forgive me, I'm a little nervous after these results. They fully grasp the arguments we present, whether numerical, technical, or material. Maybe that's the key.
Now, we'll come back to the pyramids a little later, because there's still another question, but for now let's listen to what viewers are asking. Go ahead, Maxime.
It's very interesting. The discussion is always about human history, but Sergei decided to go further, and his question is set in the context of the structure of the universe, the solar system as a whole.
Hello, my name is Sergei, from Moscow. The thing is, a year or two ago there was a TV show with American mathematicians and astronomers. Based on mathematical and astronomical calculations, they argued that the solar system is at most 15 to 20,000 years old. This was based on the planetary orbits and the Sun's annual loss of diameter. Roughly 15,000 years ago, the Sun's diameter should have equaled Earth's orbit. Their conclusion was that the solar system is no more than 15,000 years old. That's why I am inclined to believe that humanity may be only 1,000 years old. Do you agree with that?
That's a whole different proof system from the age of the universe itself.
Sergei worked a miracle. In an instant, he turned me from a super optimist into just as much of a super skeptic. I'm not familiar with that material, I didn't see that program, and I haven't seen such evidence. Once again, everything inside me rises up in protest. I studied astronomy, physics, everything I could.
It's hard to believe right away, isn't it?
What's happening to me now is the same as what happened back when I first began reading Anatoly Fomenko's book Empire. Knowing that the most incredible things are possible, I can still say, I just cannot imagine such a thing. No way, not at all.
And yet, who knows?
As an honest man, I will certainly read it, of course, if I manage to find this material.
After 3 broadcasts, I already understand that maybe anything is possible, especially after our polls. I'd like to wrap up with the pyramids, because when we spoke about them, you said it was very important to understand why they were built, and whether there were any inscriptions on them, and if not, then why? If we follow Fomenko's hypothesis, what were the pyramids built for? Why did they suddenly appear? And are there any inscriptions on them?
There is a hypothesis, though really, it is just that, a hypothesis, that this was in fact a valley where the greatest khans of the empire were buried.
So, they were tombs, roughly speaking?
Let's put it this way. For now, since there aren't any other reasonable and rational hypotheses, we stick with that. As for why there are no inscriptions on them, Andrei, allow me to cite a well-documented historical fact from the 19th century. Napoleon in Egypt. You know the story, right? The infantry square, scientists and donkeys in the middle, and so on. But there's a fact, not widely publicized, whose consequences are very clear today. You've probably seen the numerous photos of the Sphinx, where the face shows severe damage. Do you know what caused it?
No.
Napoleon ordered cannons to be aimed point blank and fired at the Sphinx.
Why?
A very fair question. There's an opinion that something was knocked off, an inscription, an image, or something else. In any case, there must have been some rational reason to fire artillery at the face of the Sphinx.
But Napoleon. That's not 1,000 years ago, it's just over 200 years ago. And there are no records left about why he did it. The scientists and donkeys standing nearby, those scientists never wrote anything about it.
There's a version. The traces of the empire were being erased. Our version is that they were erasing the traces of the empire. And this wasn't the only trace destroyed in such a radical way.
Which empire?
That very same giant Mongol or Mughal empire, whose founders and creators were our ancestors. Andrei, not the Mongols from Central Asia, but Mongols in the sense of Russians, Turks, Tatars, Ukrainians, Belarusians in today's terminology. Back then, those distinctions didn't exist.
Do you believe that our civilization is only 1,000 years old? Again, the majority, twice as many people, believe it. That is, they are ready to reject what they were taught in school and accept the hypothesis of academician Fomenko. I should mention that our poll isn't rigged. In fact, people even pay 5 rubles to participate. And here's the result we see. Honestly, I'm astonished. Just astonished. I never expected this. Let's take a call.
Nadezhda, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. I'd like to know, what about the lost Atlantis? Did it really exist, and what time period can it be dated to? Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your question. That's one that gets asked often. Again, as someone who stands on facts and logic, I have to say, if Plato wrote about Atlantis, then most likely it's an echo of something real. But what exactly was real? And when did it happen? Within our hypothesis, within our line of research, this has not yet been studied, and unfortunately, we can't give any definite answer. What matters is, we proceed from the idea that it makes sense to talk strictly about events within the framework of our civilization. Because often this question is dragged toward notions like the fourth root race, the fifth root race, esoteric traditions. That's not our path. We talk only about things that can either be touched, counted, or otherwise confirmed.
So, within Fomenko's hypothesis, within that world he is constructing, there's no place for Atlantis?
Not yet, since we can't define it. What is Atlantis? What was called by that name? You may recall, back in our first program, we agreed that the first step is to understand what certain words and names actually referred to. I simply don't know what was meant by Atlantis. Perhaps someone within our group is already conducting such research, but it hasn't yet been systematized or analyzed.
Please, Maxime.
Marina, with a uniquely feminine perspective on historical chronology. Marina, please.
Good evening. There are different architectural styles. For example, the Gothic style, which is dated to the Middle Ages. You say that the pyramids may also belong to the Middle Ages, along with the Colosseum. How could two such different architectural styles exist at the same time? Could you explain, please? Thank you.
That's an interesting and unexpected turn.
We'll have to approach it from the opposite angle. There is the absolutely remarkable St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Please forgive me if I'm mistaken. It's a Gothic cathedral, a magnificent structure with striking minarets at its sides. Genuine minarets, with balconies and ornate railings for the clergy.
That supports the hypothesis that there was once a single common religion, doesn't it?
Yes, and within that common religion and shared culture, naturally, there existed a variety of styles. These differed according to factors such as climate. For example, in the south, enormous temples and structures could be built with no need for heating. In our latitudes, where there is heavy snow and frost each year, architecture had to account for heating. So, the style was completely different: massive walls, low vaulted ceilings, and so forth. In other words, the differences likely stemmed from such practical considerations. Also, despite being a single empire, it was vast. And despite the unity of the peoples living at that time, even then related but distinct architectural styles were emerging and developing, which later became more fully expressed in certain regions.
I see. Please, Maxime.
Alexander Pavlovich, over to you.
I'm listening.
No, Alexander Pavlovich, it's us who are listening to you.
I'd like to ask a question. Have you considered your theory in the context of the development of weaponry before and after the Common Era? That is, the sword, cold steel weapons, the spear, and the bow, according to the traditional theory, remained virtually unchanged for nearly 10 centuries. But logically, during that time there should have been a giant leap forward, a global change in arms.
The question is clear.
A brilliant example. Moreover, in the first 3 issues of the magazine Ogoniok this year, the deeply respected and much-loved chess player Garry Kasparov published a series of articles, or perhaps a single article in several parts, where he drew attention to various puzzles and inconsistencies, including those concerning weapons. A fair observation. By the way, if we draw a parallel with the history of weaponry in China, in traditional history it is well known that the Chinese invented everything centuries before Europeans. But in Europe, once the monk Schwartz's first experiment went off with a bang in the laboratory and he realized he had discovered an explosive substance, gunpowder, within just a few decades everyone was firing at each other with culverins, mortars, cannons, muskets, and goodness knows what else. Meanwhile, in China, in some mysterious way, for almost 1,000 years gunpowder remained limited to fireworks and entertainment rockets, never applied to weapons. Why? This observation itself shows that the one thing which always develops quickly and consistently is weaponry. But if we look at official history, ancient Rome supposedly lasted almost 1,000 years, or at least many centuries, while using the same shields, short swords, pila, and so on.
Let me ask to pause our interactive poll. Andrei Vladimirovich, I think you'll find the results interesting. Do you believe our civilization is only 1,000 years old? Please.
Yes, 110 calls, no 57.
I don't think we need to be fancy with this. It's obvious that people are ready for new perspectives. Apparently, they are ready to look at history with new eyes. All the questions you've been asking prove it. I'll now ask a question not on behalf of Andrei Podoynitsyn, but on behalf of our talk show. Here it is. Do you think it makes sense to continue our discussion of academician Fomenko's hypothesis? The phone numbers remain the same. I must remind you that this interactive poll costs 5 rubles per call. It will remain active until the end of the broadcast, and afterward, all through the night until noon tomorrow. So, right after the show, tomorrow morning, and during the day, you can call these numbers. Depending on your answers, we will either continue this discussion at some point, or we won't. Thus, whether this conversation continues, now depends entirely on you. A reminder. Until the end of the show, after the show, and until 12 noon tomorrow. Here's a question that has been raised many times in various letters and calls. Do you know how Western historians and scholars react to Fomenko's theory? Do they have, so to speak, their own Fomenkos? Excuse me, the numbers are moving again. Already 43, 45, 48, 49. The numbers keep rising. People think this discussion should go on. So, call today and after the end of our broadcast. Now, about Western scholars.
Andrei, I'm sorry, but it seems you'll have to spend a bit more time talking with me on these topics. Regarding Western scholars, yes, there are foreign Fomenkos. Let me give one concrete example. Professor Heribert Illig from Germany. He also heads a similar group, but being Germans, an organized people, they set up a scientific society. There are at least 30 people in its core membership. They too have reached very unusual, I'd even say extraordinary conclusions. For example, Professor Illig and his colleagues concluded that 300 years of German history, including the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation and the well-known figure of Charlemagne, never actually existed. As honest people, we had to ask our German colleagues, if you remove those 300 years from the foundation of German history, doesn't the whole rest of the structure hang in the air? How do you deal with that? But the Germans, being extraordinarily correct and cautious, said, we won't make extremist conclusions. We'll continue our calculations. There you have it, a vivid result. By the way, a true-life reaction, if you will, Andrei. Very interesting.
Dear viewers, I must begin by expressing my sincere thanks to you. I'm looking at the results of our poll. Let me remind you that it will continue after the broadcast ends. First of all, thank you for showing such great interest in this particular question. 217 people believe we should continue this discussion. That number is still growing. About 200 fewer think otherwise. Apparently, history teachers who feel such a conversation should not be pursued. How much time do we have left? 3 minutes. If possible, a very short question and a short answer.
Andrei, allow me to say this in a single sentence. The reaction of the official press, Der Spiegel magazine called Professor Illig a National Socialist.
Please.
Pavel, as briefly as possible, please.
Who sat at the center of this vast and remarkable metropolis? Who was pulling the strings that tied together this enormous country?
So, who was the ruler of that great empire?
The metropolis was Russia Horde, that is, a territory roughly corresponding to the Russian Empire of the early 20th century. And what does pulling the strings mean? That's a harsh phrasing. The rulers of this empire were called Grand Princes, Emperors, and Khans. That is exactly how the Russian czars were titled.
Can you name some names?
Now I'm going to say something that sounds fantastic. In our reconstruction, Genghis Khan was named Georgy Danilovich, and Batu Khan was his brother, Ivan Danilovich. These two were the founders of this great empire.
Unfortunately, time has run out. These are not the final results of our poll, just what we can see for now. And what we see is clear. It's an overwhelming majority. Very soon we'll reach 300 people who believe the conversation must go on. Thank you, Andrei Vladimirovich, because I think this is largely your achievement.
Thank you, Andrei.